Just going to move this out a little bit out of the way. Well, good morning, everybody. So my name's Mark Johnson. I have been married to Alexis. Now it's a test. 2014 is when we were, no, that's when Maggie was born. 2013. I've been married to Alexis since 2013. So I'm the pastor at St. Luke United Methodist Church in Newton, Iowa. Previously, I was a pastor at Carson and Mount Hope 2-Point Charge in Southwest Iowa. Before that, I was at Broadway with Alexis. Before that, I was at Mount Vernon as an associate pastor for 2 years. So my road to ministry looked a little bit different than Alexis's. I was what they call a second career pastor. I had a life before I was a pastor, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that here this morning. So when Alexis and I got married, I was already 29 years old, so I was a little bit older. I had lived a decade plus on my own, and I struggled. I struggled to make sense of life. I struggled to figure out who I was. I had, in general, just significant struggles. But backing up, I grew up in Clinton, Iowa. Anybody know where Clinton, Iowa is? Yeah. So my parents still live there. I graduated high school when I was 18 years old, and then I moved to Pella, Iowa. Everybody know where Pella, Iowa is? That's a little bit closer. And so anyway, I went to Central College as a music performance major, classical music. And the first couple years at Central were great. They went really good. By the third year, my mental health started to take a dip. I graduated a year early, so I graduated in 3 years just to get out of there. There's nothing wrong with Central College. I love the place. I learned so much. Would never say anything bad about it. I just had a hard time. College sometimes is difficult. So anyway, I went there for 3 years. I graduated, and I moved to Iowa City. My parents, my stepfather, and my mother are artists. He was teaching at the University of Iowa at the time, and I started taking art classes. And that's how I originally moved to Iowa City. All my friends, my best friends were there too, and my parents had an art studio south of Iowa City. So at that point, all roads led to Iowa City. So I just got a regular job working at Hy-Vee for a year, and eventually I met a gentleman, and I started working at West Music, which is in Coralville. So I worked at West Music for 10 years, selling instruments, customer service with teachers, and that sort of thing. And those 10 years when I lived in Iowa City and I worked at West Music were some of the best times of my life. I had good friends, I had good times, I had a rock band, and I spent a lot of time going to rock shows in downtown Iowa City. I was involved in the creative scene at the time and all that good stuff. But at the same time, those years definitely included some of the worst times in my life, including mental health breakdowns, significant struggles, dependence on alcohol, full-blown alcoholism, whatever you want to call it, and legal problems that came about because of those things. It was a hard time. Now, I know my circumstances, the things I went through, the struggles, were not unique to me. Those are a lot of problems that a lot of people go through. And if it's not alcohol or whatever, it's a different thing, right? Life is just sometimes complicated and difficult. And at least for me, my 20s, from 19 to 29, were the hardest years of my life. Yet all along the path, I had people who loved me, who invested in me, both in big and small ways, people who helped make a better future possible, people who didn't just forget about me, but people who made it possible for me to be where I'm at today. And my experience was so terribly common that we actually have a name for it, and that's called hitting rock bottom, right? Hitting rock bottom. It's an unfortunate but relatable part of life. A moment when nothing seems to work, everything feels like a dead end, exhaustion, frustration, hopelessness. We turn to things that we think will solve the issue, like alcohol, makes it worse. So there you are. So for me, all of that, the height of that stuff came when my dad passed away. He died in 2009 when I was 26. So, like mine, sometimes hitting that rock bottom involves a big dramatic event like that, a loss, a big change or transition or something like that. Other times it's slower, right? It's a realization that the path that you've been on just isn't working, or it's not taking where you thought it would, or just the relentless weight of life itself pressing down upon. I've learned a lot from experience that this life just isn't easy. And hitting rock bottom doesn't look the same for everybody, but I think we can all identify or be familiar with those experiences. Being stuck and unsure of what comes next and questioning if things will ever change. The good news is that mysteriously, unexpectedly, God works in those places. That's the space that God likes the best sometimes. Because rock bottom isn't a place of despair. It's often when we find hope, clarity, change. From rock bottom, there's only one way to go, and that's onward and upward, right? When everything falls apart, when there's nothing left to hold on to, sometimes we finally see what truly matters in life. I'm going to transition to talk a little bit here, well, not a little bit, a lot about the Transfiguration, the story that was read a little bit ago. So this is a story of Jesus who takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain, and there they have this the profound, surprising encounter where they experience God's glory in the fullest extent. Jesus' light shined brighter than they could have ever imagined. But I want to zero in on Peter specifically, the Apostle Peter, one of the most important but complex people in the Bible and in the gospel story. So Jesus gives him the name Cephas, which comes from the Aramaic word which means rock or stone, and that name points to Peter's key role as a leader in the early church. Jesus says in Matthew 16:18, I will tell you that you are Peter, or Cephas, and on this rock I will build my church. Not even the gates of Hades will overcome it. Now, I identify with Peter, and maybe you do too, because his journey becoming that rock and that leader in the church was anything but straightforward. His story begins on the Sea of Galilee, not as a leader, not as a preacher, but as a fisherman. A frustrated fisherman who was coming up with only empty nets. He and his brother Andrew were casting their nets all night long, and they caught nothing. Then he has a moment that would change his life. Jesus appears and tells him to cast it one more time. It's almost a desperation cast. Just catch them one more time. But that one more time, the catch was so overwhelming that their nets began to break. Peter's reaction is interesting. It wasn't joy. It wasn't even gratitude. It was just pure shock. He didn't understand what was happening. It was this deep sense of inadequacy. He says to Jesus, go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man. I don't deserve this good stuff. But Jesus didn't leave. Jesus stood right by him. Jesus called him into something greater, a new purpose, a new identity, a new journey of faith. Jesus took all that bad stuff, all those feelings of inadequacy or exhaustion, whatever it was, and he gave Peter another way out. He tells Peter, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. From now on, you will fish for people. Peter could have done two things. He could have walked away bitter and defeated. Instead, he dropped his nets. He left everything behind, and he followed Jesus. Now, it's a pretty good story. Sounds wonderful. Peter's struggles continue, however. Time and time again, he stumbles throughout the Gospels in his faith. He struggled to grasp what Jesus was trying to tell him. When Jesus walks on water, Peter tries, and he sinks. He fell asleep on Maundy, Thursday in the Garden of Gethsemane. Most painfully, he denies Jesus 3 times when it mattered the most. But Jesus saw something in Peter. Despite all those shortcomings, Jesus saw something. He saw something special. He saw potential. And so, without any, without any backing behind him, besides the fact that he's Jesus, Jesus names Peter the rock, not for who he was, but for who he would become. Now, a great example of how all these dynamics play out happens just right before the scripture we read, the Transfiguration, the moment when Peter is the first person to openly declare that Jesus is the Messiah. So Jesus asks, "Who do the crowd say I am?" And the disciples respond, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others, one of the prophets from long ago that has come back to life." Jesus turns to Peter and asks, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" Peter answers boldly, "You are God's Messiah, the chosen one." As quickly as he gets it right, he stumbles again. It's almost as if we're supposed to take something away from this. Jesus talks about suffering and rejection and death. He tells the disciples, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must then deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me." Those weren't the words that Peter or anybody expected from this Messiah. They wanted power and victory. Instead, Jesus pointed in a different direction. Jesus pointed to the cross. He gives this mysterious promise. He says, "Some standing here with me today will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God." He's talking, of course, about the Transfiguration. Peter wouldn't have known what he meant at the time, but 6 days later he would. Jesus leads him up a mountain. They have this experience that changes everything all over once again. There's something beautiful about that. The way that the story unfolds, sometimes slowly, sometimes in an instant. Even in Peter's journey, we have highs, we have lows, we have glimpses of glory, we have the harsh realities of the cross. I'll talk a little bit about our Methodist heritage here. John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, called this prevenient grace. Prevenient grace is the grace that goes before us, preparing us, drawing us, leading us towards God even before we recognize it or know it. And that journey isn't a straight path. It's full of up and downs, moments of clarity, moments of confusion. Yet through it all, it's that grace that keeps us moving closer to Jesus Christ. Even before Peter understood Jesus' mission, grace, this prevenient grace was at work, guiding him, revealing glimpses of the truth, preparing him for what led ahead. His confession, his resistance, even his failures weren't detours to this prevenient grace. They were all a part of the unfolding work, the shaping work, bring him to be the disciples that he was meant to be. It was God's grace that led Peter to that shoreline. It was God's grace that stirred in his heart as he watched the nets overflow. It was God's grace that moved Peter to declare Jesus as the Messiah, even though he didn't quite understand what that meant. Every step, his calling, his doubts, his failures, God was with him. God's grace was with him, already working and shaping him. The good news is that God's grace is alive in all of our lives, just as it was in Peter's, just as it has been in mine. God's prevenient grace has placed people, places, experiences in my path. Not all of them were easy. Some were frustrating. Some were painful. Some experiences felt more like obstacles than blessings. But over time, even those moments were being transformed into something beautiful. Grace often works through people and unexpected relationships, simple invitations, everyday interactions that sometimes we take for granted. For me, one of those people was a man named Don Seacrest. So there's a couple people here who remember Don Seacrest. Oh, now I can't see where they're at. Oh, it's Sherry and Mike Anderson. They were at West Branch United Methodist Church where this all happened. So they were a part of that journey too. But there was this man named Don Seacrest. He's since passed away, but when I first moved to Iowa City, we worked together at First Avenue Hy-Vee. What started as this ordinary, Don was what? Pushing 80, I would guess. I don't know, when I first met him. We had this ordinary work relationship that became something deeper. And one day, prompted by his wife, he invited me to play music at their church. It was a simple invitation. It seemed small at that time, but that invitation set something in motion that nobody could have planned, least of all myself. But looking back, I can see it clearly that God was working through Don, through that invitation, seeing this sort of broken young man that I was. God was working through that church long before I even realized it. It's an example of that prevenient grace. That God is the one going before us, laying the path that we don't even recognize. And he uses others to shape and transform, to create that path over time. Over time, those experiences kept adding up. Little by little, my faith became something I took more seriously. I started to see my place in the church differently. John Wesley calls this justifying grace. That's that moment where we say yes to that relationship with Jesus Christ. God has been drawing us in all along, and eventually we have this moment where Peter leaves the nets behind to go fish for people. That is justifying grace. The journey still doesn't stop. Discipleship's a long, lifelong process. Since those experiences, you can ask Alexis, I've had plenty of missteps, times I've screwed up, things I shouldn't have said. I've resisted what God was doing in my life. There have been times I've struggled and times I've fallen short. But through it all, I'm grateful. Not because I call myself a failure, but for what those failures taught me. Each mistake was an opportunity to grow, to see that grace a little bit more clearly. Peter denied Jesus and was later restored, which teaches us that God doesn't require us to be perfect. God meets us where we're at and keeps leading us forward each and every day. To me, that's the story of the Transfiguration. Jesus speaks about hard truths to his disciples. He tells them about the suffering, the sacrifice, the cost of discipleship. He also gives Peter and the others a glimpse of something greater. Because on top of that mountain, in a moment beyond anything they could have imagined or seen before, Jesus is transfigured. His face becomes shining. His clothes are dazzling like lightning. Moses and Elijah appear, and they speak with him. The disciples are clearly overwhelmed. The text says they were weighed down by sleep. And just as suddenly as it began, it's over. The vision fades, the mountain's quiet, and they're left alone with Jesus. The mountaintop moment didn't last forever, but it had a clear message that yes, there will be suffering, yes, there will be hard times, yes, the road will be hard, but despite all that, Jesus is who he says he is. And the kingdom of heaven is truly breaking into the kingdom of earth. And through it all, it's grace that leads us forward. Now, as I told the kids, that light of Transfiguration, the light that radiated from Jesus wasn't just a physical light. It wasn't ultraviolet light. It wasn't light from the sun. It was the very presence of God. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 3, very beginning of the Bible, God says, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now that happens before the sun, the moon, the stars were created. This is a light that already existed. A light that God saw and called good, a light that separated darkness from creation itself. That's the light of the Transfiguration. Not the light from the sun, but the light Moses encountered on Mount Sinai. The light that filled the temple in the Old Testament. It's not something we see as a visible light, but something that transforms, drawing us deeper into God, reshaping us from the inside out. Head's probably spinning right about now. But so far I've talked about prevenient grace. I've talked about justifying grace, the moment we say yes to that relationship and we step into faith. In the Wesleyan tradition, we call the next step sanctifying grace. That God just doesn't save us and leave us where we're at. That God keeps transforming us, keeps forming us in the image of Christ. Peter's journey didn't stop with that confession. And our faith isn't just about believing in God, but it's about who we are becoming as disciples of Jesus Christ. Peter and James and John weren't just witnessing the glory, they were being invited into it. They were being invited to participate in heaven on earth. This is the same Peter who stumbled, who doubted, who denied, now transforming into a leader of the early church. Reminds us that this is our journey too, because each and every one of us in here are disciples. Each and every one of us in here is a leader of the church, whether you want to be called that or not. And the light that shone from Jesus is that same light that shines through us. Sanctification, that big fancy church word that John Wesley used, isn't about achieving perfection in a certain way. It's about stepping deeper into the presence of God, being shaped by that glory and becoming more fully who we were created to be. So when I was young, I actually grew up in the Lutheran Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. But when I was young, I was taught to sing This Little Light of Mine, the song that we sang with the kids. It's a simple message, but also an invitation to let our light shine, that eternal flame that resides within each and every one of us. But over time, sometimes we forget. We become adults. Life happens. Doubt creeps in. We fear what others might think of us. We fear what discipleship might cost us personally. So like a lot of people, I kept that light hidden. But now I know better. I understand that the light was never mine to create. It was God's light, just waiting to be revealed. I don't regret the years I spent keeping it dim. Grace was working. Things were happening even then. But now I have a choice. And I will let it shine boldly, without fear, without hesitation, not for my sake, but this world needs the light of Christ. Today, I'm up here asking you to do the same. Because the light of Christ, the light of Genesis chapter 1, the light that shone on the mountain, the light that sanctifies and transforms, was never meant to be hidden. It was meant to be shared. And so, we will let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Amen? One of the ways that we do this is through the table of Holy Communion. And it's my privilege to preside over that.